On September 15, 1944, Hiroshi Yamamoto crouched low in the reinforced bunker on Bloody Nose Ridge, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. He had been here for 3 long months, watching the American war machine inch closer to Peleliu, but his confidence was unshaken. The ridge, with its jagged coral rocks and thick defensive walls, was a fortress, one that had been meticulously fortified against every assault the Americans had thrown at the Pacific garrisons. Yamamoto's unit had dug into the terrain, setting up overlapping fields of fire, concrete reinforced positions, and strategic sightlines extending over the invasion beaches. Every decision had been made with precision. They had prepared for this moment. The ridge was the key to holding Peleliu. Yamamoto could almost hear the rhythmic hum of his soldiers' nerves as they braced for what they knew was coming. They had studied every American assault in the Pacific from Tarawa to Saipan, and had learned from them. They knew what to expect. Mortar fire, naval bombardments, riflemen pushing forward across open ground. He had accounted for all of it. He was certain his men would hold firm, like their predecessors in the Pacific, who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of land. When the American forces came, they would push back, and then they would see the true might of the Japanese defense. The first wave hit the beaches at 0600, just as Yamamoto had anticipated. The sound of the bombardment echoed across the ridge, shaking the ground beneath his feet, but the concrete walls held. The American forces were approaching in carefully coordinated waves, just as their strategy had predicted. He looked out over the landscape through the narrow slit of the bunker, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic scene unfolding below. The beaches were littered with craters from the constant barrage, smoke billowing into the sky, but his defensive lines remained intact, his men firing from the fortified positions without hesitation. Yet, something felt wrong. The fire from the enemy seemed to be coming from a different direction. Yamamoto's instincts kicked in, but his experience told him that this was no ordinary assault. He heard the distant rumble of machine gun fire, a sound at once familiar and utterly alien. It was louder than anything he had encountered before, and it was continuous, relentless. The distinctive rhythmic bursts he had expected didn't come. Instead, it was a continuous roar, a thunderous wall of noise that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. The ground shook as the first round hit. Yamamoto turned sharply, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw the coral rock near the base of his position disintegrate under the onslaught. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. His men scrambled to respond, but the sound of the fire grew louder, closer, relentless. In less than 4 minutes, the first reinforced position was torn apart, the concrete walls crumbling under a hail of fire that felt like it would never stop. Soldiers who had only moments before been positioned to defend the ridge were now frantically ducking, scrambling for cover. But there was no escape from the thunderous roar. The bullets tore through the air with brutal precision, cutting down anything that moved. Yamamoto's hands shook as he grabbed his field glasses, scanning the distance for any sign of where the fire was coming from. He knew his defensive lines had been designed to withstand mortar fire, artillery, even the heaviest of American machine guns, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just the power of the weapon. It was the way it moved, the way it seemed to own the battlefield, unrelenting and unstoppable. It didn't just tear through men. It seemed to tear through the very air, leaving nothing in its wake but death. As his men struggled to return fire, Yamamoto's thoughts began to unravel. The positions had been carefully chosen. The heavy machine guns should have been more than enough to hold them back. And yet, as he watched his men fall one by one, as the very ground beneath him began to disintegrate, he realized that no amount of preparation, no matter how meticulously planned, could have accounted for what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a battle, it was the obliteration of everything they had built, everything they had fought for. His thoughts began to swirl with panic, as it became clear that his defenses were no match for this new, horrific weapon. By the time the sun had set, Yamamoto was writing furiously in his journal, his hand trembling with each word. Akuma no Buki, he wrote. The devil's weapon. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he knew it had changed everything. The M2 Browning had entered the battlefield, and with it, the rules of warfare had been rewritten. As the night fell and the echoes of the American fire continued to haunt the ridge, Yamamoto could only look on in stunned silence at the carnage unfolding below, helpless in the face of an industrial power he had never imagined. The roar of the M2 Browning had not only torn through the coral and concrete but had shattered the very essence of Japanese defense doctrine. In the days to come, when the full scale of the devastation became apparent, Yamamoto would understand that his defenses had been nothing more than a paper tiger in the face of the sheer industrial might that had been unleashed upon them. The terror of the devil's roar would be felt across the battlefield, and the sound of it would echo in the minds of the men who had faced it long after the battle was over. Yamamoto had spent months preparing for this moment. His position, carved into the unforgiving coral of Bloody Nose Ridge, was supposed to be the perfect defense against any American assault. Each section of the ridge had been methodically reinforced, every field of fire calculated with precision. His men had spent countless hours digging into the terrain, laying down heavy concrete bunkers, and placing machine guns with interlocking fields of fire that could sweep across every approach. They had built walls of coral and concrete thick enough to stop artillery shells, and their positions were designed to create a killing zone where no American could advance without facing an overwhelming barrage of rifle fire, mortar explosions, and machine gun suppression. Yamamoto knew his defenses were formidable. His men were well trained, drilled into the belief that they were ready for anything the Americans could throw at them. The layout of the ridge, with its maze of bunkers and carefully positioned gun emplacements, was designed to disorient the enemy, to make them feel trapped before they even reached the Japanese lines. Each machine gun had a specific target, and the crossfire between positions was intended to neutralize any threat long before it could reach the heart of the Japanese defenses. But even as he surveyed his work, Yamamoto could not shake the feeling of unease that tugged at him. There was something about this assault, something different. The Americans had been relentless in their campaigns, but this battle, this fight for Peleliu, felt more intense. They had never fought on terrain like this, where every inch of ground was contested with brutal ferocity. And as he looked down over the ridge with the first wave of American troops advancing, he knew this was going to be a battle unlike any other. At 0600 hours, the first American assault began. The sharp crack of rifle fire and the booming explosions of naval bombardment shook the air. But Yamamoto's men stood firm, their machine guns cutting into the advancing Marines, pushing them back as expected. The interlocking fields of fire worked flawlessly at first, and Yamamoto allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had held their ground in previous battles, and this was no different. But then, at 0612 hours, something unimaginable happened. From an unexpected angle, a thunderous roar filled the air. The sharp, staccato bursts of machine gun fire Yamamoto was accustomed to suddenly became a relentless, continuous wave of sound. A deep, unyielding hammering that shook the very ground beneath his feet. It was not like any fire he had ever heard. His soldiers had trained for the noise of American machine guns, had readied themselves for the rapid bursts of fire from the Browning automatic rifle or the heavier M1919S. But this was something entirely different. Yamamoto's eyes widened as the first rounds of the M2 Browning hit their target. He had read about the Americans' heavy machine guns, of course, but he had never imagined them to be this powerful. The weapon roared to life with an intensity that made the very air around them vibrate. The impact was immediate. The machine gun fire was not merely suppressing, it was obliterating. In mere seconds, a fortified bunker, one that had been carefully constructed with reinforced concrete and coral rock, began to disintegrate. The M2's .50 caliber rounds, each one 4 times heavier than standard rifle ammunition, tore through the stone like paper, punching holes in the walls and tearing apart the structure from the inside out. The defenders, unprepared for such a sustained assault, scrambled to return fire, but it was futile. The M2 was a weapon of industrial power, capable of firing 450 to 550 rounds per minute with pinpoint accuracy over incredible distances. And unlike the Japanese machine guns, which had to fire in short bursts to avoid overheating, the M2 could sustain its fire indefinitely. It was the sound of industrial warfare, an unstoppable tide of destruction that tore through positions with the fury of a storm. Yamamoto watched, helpless, as his meticulously planned defenses were rendered irrelevant in a matter of minutes. Bunkers that had been designed to withstand direct artillery fire were reduced to rubble, their walls cracking and crumbling under the relentless barrage. His men, who had been so confident in their defenses, were now fighting a losing battle. The American machine gun crews had already begun to reposition, advancing to new positions while continuing their destructive fire. Yamamoto could see the terror in the eyes of his soldiers as they realized that no matter how deep they dug into the coral or how thick the walls were, they could not withstand this weapon. The M2 Browning wasn't just a machine gun. It was an industrial force of destruction, an unstoppable wall of fire that rendered all of Yamamoto's careful preparations meaningless. The first casualties fell quickly. A machine gun position that had been set up to cover a gap in the defense was shattered by the first sustained burst. The crew inside, trained to hold their ground at all costs, never even had a chance to return fire before they were torn apart. And then the others followed. Positions that had been covered by overlapping fields of fire were now exposed. The soldiers, unable to hear anything over the deafening roar of the M2, were forced to retreat, unable to even comprehend where the enemy fire was coming from. The continuous fire felt like it came from everywhere at once, and the soldiers could do nothing but run for cover. At the heart of the ridge, Yamamoto could feel his stomach drop. The battle he had prepared for was slipping away from him, and he couldn't understand why. His men, his defenses, they had been designed for this moment. But they had underestimated the power of the M2. He thought he had prepared for everything, except for the overwhelming firepower of an industrial machine designed to destroy everything in its path. By the time the sun began to set, Yamamoto's defenses were in ruins. His soldiers, the men he had trusted to hold the line, were broken. Their morale shattered. They no longer believed they could hold the ridge. And as the roar of the M2 Browning continued, Yamamoto knew that he had just faced a weapon that would change the course of the Pacific War forever. The M2 Browning didn't just tear apart positions. It tore apart the very will to fight. Yamamoto's soldiers, seasoned and battle-hardened, had never encountered anything like it. The first burst of fire came like a thunderclap, and the world seemed to freeze in its wake. The sound was unlike anything they had heard before. There was no rhythm to it, no brief pause between bursts. It was an unrelenting roar, a thunderous scream that rattled the very air around them. The M2's continuous fire didn't just suppress. It shattered. At first, the men manning the bunkers thought it was a mistake. Surely this couldn't be real. But as the seconds dragged on, and the sound of the fire didn't stop, they began to realize that this was no ordinary weapon. The rounds were tearing into the coral rock, the reinforced concrete, the very walls they had spent months constructing. The bunkers, their carefully fortified havens, began to crack and crumble under the relentless onslaught. The walls, designed to withstand artillery fire, were no match for the industrial power of the M2. The weapon wasn't just destroying positions, it was destroying their belief in their own invulnerability. As the M2's roar continued, a strange feeling spread among the men. It wasn't just fear of death. It was a deeper, more visceral terror. The sound of the M2 became a harbinger of doom. It wasn't just a weapon, it was an inevitability. The continuous fire seemed to say that no matter how deeply they dug into the earth, no matter how many layers of concrete and coral they piled up, they could not escape it. The sound was everywhere. It seemed to come from all directions, like a relentless wave crashing over them. And with each burst of fire, the men's resolve cracked just a little bit more. The psychological toll was immediate. The once proud defenders of Bloody Nose Ridge, trained to fight to the death, began to falter. They weren't running from death. They were running from something far worse. The M2's roar shattered their confidence, their sense of security, and their will to fight. Positions that had been considered impregnable just hours before were now abandoned in the face of this unyielding terror. It wasn't the destruction of the positions that drove the soldiers away. It was the sound, the unrelenting power, and the certainty that no matter how much they fought, they could never withstand it. By the time the first few waves of retreating soldiers began to move, the psychological damage had already been done. Even those who stayed behind were no longer fighting with the same resolve. They were waiting for the inevitable, and in that waiting, they were already broken. The M2 had done its work, not just by tearing through the defenses but by tearing through the very spirit of the defenders. The sound of the M2 was the sound of surrender, long before the soldiers even left their positions. The M2 Browning was forged in the fires of war, a product of necessity during the chaos of World War I. But it wasn't until it met the hardened defenses of the Pacific Islands that its true power was realized. The weapon's evolution from an anti-aircraft gun to a ground combat force is a tale of technological ingenuity, blending firepower, design, and purpose to create a weapon that would change the face of warfare. John Moses Browning, the legendary American firearms designer, first created the M2 Browning in 1918, intending it for anti-aircraft use. During World War I, it was clear that traditional infantry weapons couldn't match the speed and mobility of enemy aircraft. Browning's creation, however, was designed to hit fast-moving targets at great distances, offering a level of sustained firepower that had not yet been seen on the battlefield. But the real revolution came when the M2 was adapted for ground combat in the late 1930s. The M2 Browning was a monster of a weapon, with specifications that made it far superior to anything the Japanese had encountered. It fired .50 caliber BMG, Browning machine gun cartridges, rounds that were 4 times heavier than standard rifle ammunition. Each round carried more than 4 times the kinetic energy of a typical bullet, capable of piercing steel armor at distances of up to 500 yards. Its rate of fire ranged from 450 to 550 rounds per minute in its standard configuration, and with modifications, it could fire up to 600 rounds per minute. It was designed for sustained fire, with a heavy barrel and robust construction that allowed it to fire continuously without suffering the overheating problems of lighter machine guns. Unlike the Japanese machine guns, which required controlled bursts to prevent barrel overheating, the M2 could unleash wave after wave of destruction without slowing down. The M2 was more than just a firearm. It was a force of nature. Its muzzle velocity was an astonishing 2,910 feet per second, propelling rounds with enough power to tear through reinforced concrete and shatter steel armor. This made it not just a tool for suppression, it was a weapon of annihilation, capable of breaking through anything in its path, whether it was enemy troops, vehicles, or fortifications. The M2 was designed to create fear as much as it was designed to kill. But the true power of the M2 wasn't just in its ability to destroy, it was in its versatility. It could be mounted on a variety of platforms, from stationary tripods to vehicles like jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks, creating mobile firepower that could change the course of a battle. The weapon was capable of repositioning rapidly across the battlefield, ensuring that wherever the enemy went, the M2 could follow, raining death upon them from any direction. As it arrived in the Pacific theater, the M2 quickly became a weapon of terror for the Japanese. The American Marines knew its capabilities, and they deployed it with precision, using its sustained fire to break through Japanese fortifications that had been thought impervious to conventional arms. The M2 Browning's devastating power wasn't just about its destructive capabilities. It was about what it symbolized: American industrial might. In a war where every inch of ground was hard-won, the M2 showed that the United States had the capacity to overwhelm any defense with a relentless, unyielding barrage of firepower. The M2 Browning was more than a weapon. It was an industrial revolution on the battlefield, and it would become one of the defining instruments of the Pacific War, changing the rules of combat and turning the tide in favor of the Allied forces. Its legacy, born from the chaos of World War I and honed through the fires of combat in the Pacific, would live on in future conflicts, solidifying its place as one of the most feared weapons of the 20th century. When the M2 Browning opened fire, it wasn't just a machine gun. It was an industrial force of destruction, a relentless wave of violence that left nothing standing in its wake. The Japanese defenders had spent months constructing their fortifications on Bloody Nose Ridge. They had built coral walls and reinforced concrete bunkers, each designed to withstand the brutal shelling of artillery and the firepower of mortar rounds. Their positions were supposed to be impregnable. The coral, a hard, unyielding rock, had been chosen for its strength, calculated to stop anything short of direct artillery hits. But nothing in the Japanese defensive plans had prepared them for the M2 Browning. The .50 caliber rounds, each more than 4 times the weight of typical infantry ammunition, struck with a force that shattered the very material these bunkers had been constructed from. The first burst of M2 fire tore into a reinforced machine gun nest, one of the most heavily fortified positions on the ridge. The coral walls, thick enough to stop 75mm artillery shells, cracked under the sheer power of the Browning's barrage. The rounds hammered through the fortifications, shattering the concrete and sending chunks of rock flying in every direction. Within moments, the once imposing position had been reduced to rubble, the sound of its collapse drowning out the roar of the M2. It wasn't just a breach, it was complete disintegration. The M2's sustained fire had torn through the layers of defense, pulverizing the coral and the concrete as if they were no more than sand. In just a few short minutes, what had taken months of meticulous planning to build was undone. The Japanese soldiers inside, who had believed their defenses would protect them from anything the Americans could throw at them, were left helpless. The positions that had been thought to be the key to holding the ridge were now nothing more than smoldering piles of debris. And the terrifying thing was, the M2 wasn't done yet. It was just beginning. It wasn't just about breaking walls, it was about breaking spirits. The M2 Browning, with its continuous roar, did more than tear through the fortified positions on Bloody Nose Ridge. It broke the will of the Japanese defenders, stripping them of their resolve and forcing them to confront a horrifying truth. No amount of training or fortification could hold against this relentless machine. As the continuous fire of the M2 hammered at their positions, the soldiers began to realize that they were not merely facing death. They were facing an industrial system that would not stop, that would not tire, and that would not relent. The Japanese soldiers, trained to fight to the death in defense of their positions, found themselves facing a weapon that made that doctrine seem futile. The M2 didn't just kill, it made the idea of standing and fighting seem pointless. As the sound of the M2 echoed across the battlefield, it began to eat away at their morale. The machine's thunderous roar became synonymous with inevitable defeat. The fortifications that had once seemed like strongholds now appeared flimsy, vulnerable to an unending stream of fire that did not stop, even when the walls crumbled. At first, the Japanese soldiers resisted. They fired back, desperate to hold the line. But as the hours passed, the realization set in. There was no escaping the M2's unyielding fire. The sound of the gun, loud and constant, was everywhere. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a harbinger of doom, a psychological force that wore down the defenders' will to fight. The fear was palpable. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the fear of knowing that no matter how hard they fought, no matter how deep they hid, the M2 would find them. The Japanese defenders, whose motto had always been hold until death, now faced a choice that had never existed before. Abandon their positions and flee, or remain and face a death so brutal and inevitable that even the bravest men couldn't stomach it. One by one, positions began to empty. The soldiers didn't wait for their fortifications to be destroyed. They ran, abandoning their posts long before the M2 reduced them to rubble. The sound of the gun was enough. It wasn't just the physical destruction of their positions, it was the psychological destruction that came with it. The M2 had broken the will to fight. What made the M2 even more terrifying? It wasn't static. It moved. Mounted on vehicles, it could chase down the enemy, leaving no escape from its thunderous roar. The versatility of the M2 Browning made it not only a terrifying stationary weapon, but an unstoppable force that could adapt to any situation on the battlefield. Mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks, the M2 became mobile firepower that followed the enemy wherever they went, ensuring that no corner of the battlefield was safe from its relentless fire. The sight of the M2 mounted on a moving vehicle was enough to send waves of fear through the Japanese defenders. They had faced heavy artillery and mortars, but those weapons came with limitations. They were slow, cumbersome, and often could only strike from a fixed position. The M2, however, was different. It could reposition rapidly, moving along the battlefield with incredible speed, allowing American forces to apply its overwhelming firepower where it was needed most. On the ground, the M2 mounted on jeeps and half-tracks could move through the dense jungle, tearing through the underbrush as it hunted down the Japanese positions. Its fire was unrelenting, and there was nowhere for the Japanese soldiers to hide. The sound of the M2's fire would echo through the trees, signaling the advance of a mobile, unstoppable force. No fortified position, no matter how well entrenched, could escape its reach. As the M2 moved forward, the Japanese defenders began to realize that they were no longer just fighting against fixed positions. They were fighting against an industrial war machine that could follow them wherever they went, cutting them down with pinpoint accuracy. The terror of the M2 mounted on vehicles was not just in its firepower, it was in its mobility, in its ability to appear where it was least expected and deliver destruction at a moment's notice. The combination of sustained fire and mobility further demoralized the Japanese forces. As the M2 mounted on tanks and jeeps pushed forward, the Japanese soldiers could hear the unmistakable roar of its fire growing louder, signaling their doom. They could no longer rely on their defensive positions to protect them. They had no choice but to flee. The M2 wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a force of nature, moving across the battlefield like a storm, leaving nothing in its path but terror and destruction. When the .50 caliber fire started, the Japanese didn't just hear it, they felt it in their bones. The M2 Browning wasn't simply a machine gun. It was a relentless force that altered the very nature of battle. Its unbroken roar filled the air, a sound that reverberated through the earth itself, sowing panic in the hearts of even the most battle-hardened soldiers. The weapon didn't just kill. It induced terror, stripping the Japanese defenders of their ability to reason, think, or respond effectively. The continuous fire didn't allow them the luxury of retreating into a mental space where they could regroup. It forced them into a state of sheer, primal survival. As the M2's rounds hammered the ridge, it became clear that the fortifications, once thought to be the invulnerable heart of Japanese defense, could not provide the protection they had promised. It wasn't the destruction of the bunkers that caused the collapse. Many of them remained intact, but the sound, the relentless, unyielding roar of the Browning, shattered their psychological defenses. The constant barrage created an overwhelming sense of helplessness that drove men to flee. Even though their positions hadn't been destroyed, the panic was inescapable. It was as if the earth itself trembled beneath the fire, and no matter how well they were hidden or fortified, there was no place safe from the M2's wrath. Soldiers, who had been trained to hold out until death, found themselves abandoning positions without a second thought. Their minds no longer functioned in the familiar logic of battle, where holding the line was paramount. Instead, they reacted like animals, fleeing from the sound that threatened to overwhelm them. The once sturdy bunkers, which had been carefully designed to withstand everything from artillery fire to mortar explosions, became prisons instead of sanctuaries. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the M2's roar, a constant reminder that no matter how deep they dug, the fire could follow them anywhere. As the hours stretched on and the M2 continued its destructive work, the Japanese defenders began to question their very purpose. The terror induced by the weapon wasn't simply physical. It was a profound psychological force that made holding their ground an unbearable proposition. Positions were abandoned, not because the fortifications had been physically destroyed, but because the psychological toll of facing the M2 Browning was too great to endure. The mental collapse of the Japanese defenders was swift and complete, as the sound of the weapon gnawed away at their will to fight, forcing them to flee, leaving their positions intact but untenable. The M2 had not just destroyed their defenses, it had broken their spirits. By the end of the Battle of Peleliu, the M2 Browning wasn't just a weapon, it was the symbol of American industrial power. It wasn't the courage of individual soldiers that won the battle, it was the relentless, ceaseless power of the machine that had broken the back of Japanese resistance. The M2 had turned the tide of the Pacific War, not through individual valor, but through the overwhelming force of American industry. The relentless barrage of fire that tore through the Japanese defenses was the product of a supply chain that could deliver ammunition in quantities the Japanese could never hope to match. The logistics behind the M2's success were as crucial to its effectiveness as the weapon itself. While the Japanese forces were struggling with critical shortages of ammunition, the American military had access to an industrial powerhouse that could sustain an unyielding barrage. The M2 Browning was fed by a constant stream of ammunition, manufactured in the vast factories of the United States, shipped across the Pacific, and delivered to the front lines with surgical precision. American industry could produce more ammunition in a single day than the Japanese could in a week. This industrial might gave the American forces an advantage that could not be countered by traditional tactics or conventional defense. The M2's impact didn't stop with the battle for Peleliu. It became a blueprint for future conflicts. Its presence on the battlefield reshaped the way military planners viewed firepower. The lesson of Peleliu was clear. The side with the greater industrial capacity would prevail. The M2 Browning was a testament to the United States' ability to produce weapons of unprecedented firepower and deploy them with lethal efficiency. Its legacy would echo across future military campaigns, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East, where its power would continue to shape the strategies of warfare for generations to come. Years after the battle, the sound of the M2 Browning still haunted the Pacific battlefield. The weapon, once dubbed the Devil's Weapon by the Japanese defenders, would continue to echo across American military history, its power unmatched, its legacy undeniable. The roar of the M2 Browning, which had once shattered the resolve of the Japanese at Peleliu, would be heard again and again on battlefields across the world, from Korea to Vietnam, Desert Storm, and beyond. Its thunderous fire became the hallmark of American industrial superiority, a symbol of the overwhelming force that could be brought to bear in any conflict. As the years passed and new technologies emerged, the M2 Browning remained a constant presence in the U.S. military arsenal. Its design, forged in the crucible of World War I and honed through the fires of the Pacific War, had proven to be timeless. In later conflicts, the M2's ability to provide sustained fire support, whether mounted on vehicles or used in stationary positions, made it a cornerstone of American military strategy. It was no longer just a weapon. It had become a symbol of the industrial power that defined the U.S. military's approach to warfare. But the M2's legacy wasn't just about its effectiveness on the battlefield. It had reshaped the way wars were fought. The psychological toll it took on the enemy, the sheer terror it instilled, would be studied by military strategists for decades to come. The M2 was more than just a tool of destruction. It was a psychological weapon, capable of breaking the will of even the most determined defenders. In the years following the battle, Japanese veterans, when asked to recall their most feared American weapon, overwhelmingly cited the M2 Browning. It was the weapon that had turned their positions into death traps, the sound that had broken their spirits long before their fortifications crumbled. For them, the M2 Browning was more than just a machine. It was a harbinger of the industrial might that had ultimately sealed the fate of the Pacific War. And so, as the M2 continued to serve in conflicts across the globe, its thunderous roar echoed not only through the jungles and deserts of foreign lands, but through the corridors of history, a reminder that, in modern warfare, industrial superiority would always tip the scales of battle. The Devil's Weapon had not just won a war, it had changed the very nature of how wars were fought.